What is a burden of proof? A burden of proof describes which party in a lawsuit or in a criminal case has the burden to prove the case. In other words, if we go to court and at the end of the day, the judge or the jury says, we are hopelessly undecided, I can't tell one way or another who's right, the burden of proof describes then who loses. In most cases, the burden of proof rests on the plaintiff or on the Commonwealth who's bringing a prosecution. So let me give you an example. If you're being prosecuted for a crime, it is always the government's job under our Constitution to prove that you committed the crime. At the end of the day, if the jury says we're not sure, the burden of proof was on the prosecution, and that means they lose and you win. In civil cases, it's a little bit more complicated. The burden of proof is lower. For one thing, it's usually what we call preponderance of the evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt. Preponderance of the evidence means just barely more than 50%, essentially. More likely than not, but it can be just barely more likely than not. They hear the contract dispute and they can't quite decide who they think is right or wrong, but they think it's more likely than not that the defendant is wrong, then they can rule for the plaintiff. But once again, if they come to the point where they say in the scales of justice, it's exactly like this and I can't tell who's right, then the plaintiff usually loses because they have the burden of proving their case. In many cases, even in a civil action, a defendant can sit back and say, I'll wait and see what you do. You can prove your case or not. Of course, in most cases, it's good for the defendant to be a little more engaged than that. The reason I said it's complicated is in some cases, a defendant bears certain parts of the burden. So for example, in an employment case, the plaintiff has to show that they believe they were subject to discrimination. But once they show that people in different classes were treated differently, the burden actually shifts to the defendant to demonstrate why their actions are not discriminatory. And in that case, they actually have to prove their case. There are other examples like that where the burden shifts or for one reason or another belongs to the defendant and not to the plaintiff. It's important to consult with an attorney about your specific case to understand better how the burden of proof impacts your decision.